All right. So, welcome everyone. This will be the last talk of the day before we all go out for drinks. Yay! In this session, I'll talk a little bit about the Apache Camel integration framework. Specifically, I'll talk about how it integrates with the FHIR specification through the FHIR project. So, both open source projects that you can find on GitHub. Sounds good? All right. Is anybody familiar with Apache Camel already? All right, nice. Some camel riders. So here's a quick summary of what I'll do. I'll quickly introduce Apache Camel briefly, and then we'll go through some FHIR use cases. There will be code involved, but don't worry, we'll go through them together. And then I'll go through some of the projects in the Camel ecosystem. So tooling, monitoring, and management. And then we'll do a live demo if there's time. All right. So a little bit about me. My name is John Poth. I work at Red Hat, or I should say IBM now. I work in a team called Fuse, which is basically an integration product. I recently wrote Camel FHIR. I've been working mainly in integration. You can find me on GitHub. I mainly work in open source projects like Apache Camel, CXF, Karaf, Synthesis, LSMap, to name a few. I'm on Twitter. My favorite is IRC on Freenode, where you can have a little chat. All right. So I said that Apache Camel is an integration framework, right? So what do we mean by integration? Integration starts when you have two systems and you want them to talk to each other, right? So these systems, they can differ in so their transport. So one could be your HL7 V2 server using your minimal layer protocol. Or you could have your FHIR server with HTTP REST APIs. But they could also differ by their data formats, right? So one could be a V2 message, the other one could be DSG1, 2, and 3, and so forth. So even with two systems, right, this can sort of sometimes be complicated, but you never have only two systems in your architecture, right? You usually have many more. And a pattern we see as developers, right, is adding systems, right, not removing them. When you add a FHIR server, you're usually keeping your V2 server in the background, right? So as you keep on adding more systems, then it becomes a hard problem, right? Integration becomes a hard problem. And that's where Apache Camel comes in. Apache Camel is the glue between disparate systems. All right, so you can't give a talk about integration without this book. The Enterprise Integration Patterns book. So it came out 15 years ago, but it's still relevant. It was written by Gregor Hoppe and Bobby Wolf. So these were two integration consultants. And what they did was they went from customer to customer solving the same integration problems, right? And they solved them so many times that they saw integration patterns emerge, right? And so they wrote this book, and it contains 65 integration patterns. It's sort of a cookbook, a how-to integrate, right? And it's language agnostic, and it's a really easy read. So even if you're not a integration developer, highly recommend it. Very insightful. So here's some of the integration patterns, right? EIPs. They're very important in Apache Camel, so we'll go through some of them. So you have your endpoint. So your endpoint is just your end system. So how do you send and receive messages from a FHIR server or Salesforce or your V2 server, right? Then you have your message. And your message is your payload, so is it DSG1 structure, 2 or 3? What type of encoding, so some metadata. What kind of request is it? Is it fire and forget, or is it request and reply, things like that. Then you have your data type transformation, so everything that's related to data manipulation, right? So from XML to JSON or back and forth. Content enricher, if you want to put some loin codes in your message, for example. Then we have patterns dealing with routing, so the splitter pattern which we'll see later on. So if you have a single request and you want to span multiple ones, or conversely, you want to use the aggregated pattern to emerge multiple requests. The dynamic router, so dynamically route a message based on its content, and so on and so forth, right? So basically the idea I want to get across is that for every integration problem, you'll have a set of enterprise integration patterns that'll help you solve your problem, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel each time. Right. So theory is cool, but implementations are a bit more useful, right? So that's where Apache Camel comes in. At its core, it's the implementation of those integration patterns, right? So here's the 10,000 foot view, the high level architecture of Apache Camel. So with every framework, you have a camel context, and in that context, you have your routes, right? So your routes is where your integration logic lies, right? And they use what we call processors, so your EIPs, so that you're doing routing, transformation, mediation, enrichment, etc. and so forth. And at the bottom here, you have your components, so your end systems, right? So your file system, for example, your FTP server, JMS, HTTP, FHIR, Salesforce, etc., right? Okay, so where can you run Camel? So basically, anywhere you can run Java. So at its core, Camel, is just a jar, a 4 megabyte jar. But we also provide integration with a lot of the popular frameworks. So, for example, Spring Boot, if you're a Spring Boot guy, we have tons of starters, auto configuration. If you go on the Spring Initializer website and you type in Apache Camel, it'll generate a project for you, and you're good to go. If you're an OSGI guy and you're running on Giraffe, we have a bunch of Giraffe features. If you're a JE guy and you're on an application server, you're using Wildfly AP or WebSphere, and CDI is your thing, we provide a Camel CDI component. So integration is done for you. And if you're in the cloud, we have tons of components there. So vanilla Kubernetes or AWS, Azure, Google, etc. and so forth, right? So let's get to it. So this is the most important slide if you don't know Camel. So your integration logic lies within route, right? And it comes in two flavors, your XML or your Java domain-specific language, so DSLs, right? They're equivalent in functionality, so you want to choose what you're more comfortable with or what your environment requires. So for example, if you're doing tooling, you want to do inspection, XML is your thing, or you're using Blueprint XML, you want to use XML. Or if you're like me, you like Java, and you can just use Java. But they're equivalent in functionality. And if we look at the content, right, if you've never seen a route before, it's pretty readable, right? You should be able to sort of get what it's doing, right? You're reading from a file, which is an input directory. You're converting that to a string, and you're sending it to a JMS queue, right? So it should be fairly readable, and simplicity here is key. All right. So a word on the number of components. So the components, right, are your end systems, and we have over 200 in Apache Camel. So if you want to connect to a system, chances are there's a component there that you can just use, and you're ready to go. I've listed some of them. Nobody knows all of them by heart. So you have your enterprise endpoints, so file, FTP again, JMS, your databases, your cloud, again, Google, AWS, Azure, Kubernetes. You have your FHIR component. We have HL7 v2, and your SaaS, right, Salesforce, Gmail, etc., etc. And they're extensible, right? And so one important thing to note about Apache Camel is its extensibility, right? You can easily extend it. So as developers, right, when you choose a framework, you usually have one or two use cases that you run with your framework, and then you decide to adopt the framework. And then you get into sort of a corner case, and then your framework doesn't support it, and then you implement this hacky solution, or you drop the framework altogether. In an integration, that happens all the time, right? So Camel's really extensible. So we do that through SPIs that you can implement, or events that you can listen to, and then you have your custom solution. Here are some of the things that you can implement. So as I said earlier, the component one. So if you have a proprietary HL7 server, you can definitely implement your own component, and you don't have to push it to GitHub or anything. You can just keep it wherever you liked. We have our registry, for example. So if you want to fetch some resources somewhere, you can implement your registry interface. Data formats, your language, so you have your V2 Terser, but if you want another one, you can implement one. And we fire a bunch of events, so when you receive a message, we fire an event. When your route starts, we fire an event. When there's an error, etc., etc. I mean, you get the idea. There's lots of events that you can listen to, and the goal of this, right, is that you can implement your own. You don't have to push your code to GitHub or wait for another release. You can just implement your own, and you're ready to go, right? So that's the idea. All right. So what's Camel FHIR? So it's a happy camel, right? Internally, it embeds Happy FHIR, right? Just the client. So I posted a link here of the project on GitHub, so you can give it a star. It's James Agnew, which you probably can find here somewhere. I basically just added a FHIR component, so, right, to talk to your FHIR server, and two data formats, XML and JSON from the spec, Spring Boot starters and auto configuration, and Karaf features. So one thing to note, it was supposed to be released, but we had some problems last week upgrading to Java 11. So if you want to try out now, you have to work on Snapshot. And if not, you can wait until the end of the month. It's probably going to be released soon. So in terms of functionality, what do we have? So if you're familiar with Happy FHIR, this slide should be familiar. We have your API and your configuration. So in your API, you have all your create, delete, update, search, everything in the specification, right, more or less. For example, there's only read, there's not vread. And you have your configuration, so if you want to configure authentication, OAuth or basic authentication, HTTP configurations, encoding, parser options, etc., right? We just expose all the internals of Happy FHIR client for you to use, basically. Okay. Right, and so yeah, so we embed Happy FHIR, so we do support DSG1, 2, 3, R4, etc., etc. So where does Camel FHIR fit, right? What can it do for you? This is your, like, say, basic architecture, right? So you have your FHIR server, right? Your new FHIR server, and you probably have some website or some fancy apps. You have your V2 server in the background, right? You might have a terminology server, right? And you might have some exported data, right? So here are some files. It could be a database or whatever from some system you don't have access to, right? So you have a bunch of different systems, and Camel's your integration engine, right? It's going to help you talk and communicate between your different systems. All right, so this is the architecture we're going to base our examples on. So just keep that in mind. So first scenario, right? Say you have some exported data, right? Some patient data in form of CSV files. And you basically want to import all of those in your FHIR server, right? And we're also going to handle error handling and redelivery, right? First route. All right, let's go. So this is a CDI route. So first we give it a context name, right? A camel context name. The reason for that is when you're sifting through logs, your camel, if you don't specify one, will generate a random one, which is not that useful. So you want to give it a name, and you also want to give your routes names, right? So here's the logic, basically, in our route. So we extend a route builder class, and here we always write our integration logic, right? So here we're reading from a file. We're using the file component, and it's going to be an input directory. These two curly brackets basically mean that we're injecting properties from a file called application.properties. Simple, right? Same for your server URL and your FHIR version, right? So you externalize all your configuration, right? So once you read your file, you want to unmarshal that to some content, right? So we use the unmarshaler to CSV, and then we're going to convert that to a bundle, right? So it's going to be a bundle full of patients, and you're going to use the transaction, right, API with bundle, and you're going to pass it your server URL again and your FHIR version. Now you can pass in more options, but here I just kept it to a minimum for simplicity's sake. And once you get the response, you're going to marshal it back to JSON, and you're going to log the response, right? And then you're done importing, right? Let's see what error handling looks like. So let's assume that an error is thrown, and you want to handle it when you're unmarshaling, right? So here it's basically similar to your try catches. You just write on exception, and you pass in the exception name. We're going to mark the exchange as handled, right? So we don't process it anymore. We're going to do some logging again, and then we're going to send it back to a error directory, right? You don't want to lose your patient data. You could just send it to a database or send yourself an email, whatever you want, right? All right, so redelivery. Say you have some network problems, or your route starts up before your FHIR server starts up. You're going to get a connect exception, right? So here it's the same construct on connect exception. Do some error logging, and say you want to redeliver your message at most 5 times. You want to wait 3 seconds before each redelivery, and you want to back off multiplier of 2. So the first time you're going to wait 3 seconds, and the second time you're going to wait 6 seconds, and so on and so forth, right? So we have more options, but I figure 3 is enough to illustrate the point, right? All right, so our second scenario, right? Suppose you want to expose a RESTful API that's going to accept a medical record number, all right? And we're going to query the FHIR patient, and we want to insert that into our HL7 server. But we also want to query all observations related to that patient and bundle that into a single V2 message, right? Simple. Okay, so same construct. We give it an ID, a name, and in the configure method, we configure our REST server, right? So here I'm using Undertow, but you could have used Jetty or Tomcat or Netty or any REST compliant component, basically. Now the minimum configuration for that is your host and port. And we also want to expose a Swagger doc, right? Open API. So what you have to do is just set an API context path. Here it's API doc, and we're going to set a title property to patient observation example. And you also have to add camel swagger to your class path, and then you're done. So now that we've finished exposing our REST server, we're ready to define some REST APIs. And for that, we're going to use the REST DSL. So how that works is that, so for example, here you pass it a method, get patient observation. It's going to take a parameter called medical record number. You're going to return some text. And then we're going to send it to what we call the direct component, and you give it a name, get FHIR patient observation. Here the direct component is just a way of splitting your routes into subroutes. It's just similar to methods in class. So if I go to the next slide, you'll find the direct component here, right? Just linking. All right, so now that we have our medical record number, we're ready to query our FHIR server, right? So here we're setting up our call. So we're saying, okay, I want to read a patient. It's going to be ID the medical record number. And observations, right? We're going to use the search API. And so we're going to give it a search URL. So it's going to be all observations referencing the patient with the given ID. And now, as I said, we want to multicast, right? We want to do two calls at the same time to our FHIR server, right? Because your FHIR server might not support doing one call to fetch all the resources, right? So we want to multicast, right? And we want to do parallel processing. And here we're specifying the read and the search, right? It's going to be a read by resource ID, and you give it the server URL and FHIR version, and same for the search by URL. Now, when your calls are done, right, you have two calls, but you want to aggregate them, right? So how do you aggregate them? Into one object, you pass in an aggregation strategy. So here I named it patient observation to bundle aggregation strategy. Not very good at naming. And then so here, right, you end your multicast and you're done. You have your bundle, and now you want to send your V2 message, right? So again, here I split up my route using the direct component, and then we're going to send the bundle to a endpoint that's going to convert our bundle to a HL7 message, and we're ready to convert that and send that to over the wire TCP to our V2 server, right, that we configured here. And here we're using our HL7 decoder and encoder that we provide in Apache Camel. If those don't suit your need, you can put your own in there. And then it's going to return the response, right? And then so we're done with our second scenario. Let's look at our last scenario, and it's going to be a little similar, right? So we're going to expose a REST API again, but instead of accepting one medical record number, we're going to accept a list of medical record numbers, and they're going to be separated by, say, a comma, right? Now, for each medical record number, we want to fetch the patient from the FHIR server and do an upsert in Salesforce, right? So upsert is update if it exists, insert if it doesn't. And we want to handle each medical record number in a separate thread for performance reasons. All right, so more of the same. You configure your REST component here. Here we're using Jetty. So you configure it with a host and port. We're going to expose our open API here and give it a title. So same as before. Here we're going to call our REST API update patients, MRNs. We're going to return JSON. And we're going to use a direct component called Synchronize Salesforce, right? So here's what the route looks like, right? So as I said, we want to split the request, right? So what we're going to do here is use the splitter pattern. And we're going to split on the header called medical record numbers, right? So that's the call we're going to get. And we're going to use the comma as a token. And we're going to give it an aggregation strategy called aggregate Salesforce response. You can do whatever you want here, but basically in this example, I just concatenated the responses, but you can do whatever you want. And we do parallel processing again, and here we're going to stop when there's an exception. Okay, so here we're going to do a bit of the same. So we're going to pass the patient as the resource. ID is going to be in the body. Then we're going to read the patient resource, right, similar to the previous example. And then we're going to convert our patient to an EHR. And then we're going to call the Salesforce endpoint and do an upsert based on the patient ID, right? And then that's going to end. And once all the calls end, we're going to call our aggregation strategy and return that response. All right. So, open source and electronic data interchange, right? EDI. So I abused a little bit our integration patterns here to hide the fact that Camel doesn't do EDI, right? And at this time, I'm not aware of an open source solution that does EDI. So EDI was when we converted, say, our V2 message to FHIR, a FHIR bundle, right? Camel doesn't cover that, right? So if you have the manpower, here's a link to the patient mappings, for example, and you have a mapping for every FHIR resource on the website. But more realistically, you'll probably partner up with a consultancy firm that does that for you, or there are some closed-sourced products that do that for you, and a couple of them integrate well with Camel, right? So it's good to know. All right, so documentation. As I said, there's over 200 components. A lot of them have many options. Nobody knows them by heart, so documentation is key. We have a website. We're building a new one. So our current website is not completely up to date for every component. So the best way is to check out the source code. And here's the link, right? So we have some documentation for every EIP. So for the component, you have a file, and for the data format, you have a file. Here there are 14 options or something for the JSON data format, right? So it's good to check out. But you don't really want to go back and forth between your code and the website, right? So one way to get around that is through tooling. So we have ID plugins for your major ID vendors. So we have one here for VS Code, but you have one for Eclipse or IntelliJ. And what it does, right, is so here your URI is a string, right? So you lose Java strong typing, which is awesome, right? So you don't know if there's an error until you run it. So the plugin will say if you have a typo, for example, or if you misspelled something, or if you specified an option that doesn't exist. It'll display some Java doc if you hover over a parameter or something. It will provide code completion, all the good stuff, right? And you can find all those here on the source code on the website, but you'll find them on your marketplace, right? Okay, so monitoring, right? So you can't really have an enterprise solution without some management monitoring, right? So we do that through Hot.io, and it's basically a web console based on plugins, right? So you have a Spring Boot plugin, you have a Camel plugin, and what it does is it'll display all your metrics here in your tabs, which I'll demo. You can debug your routes, you can check out the source code for your routes, you can start a debug session, and it also supports login, right? So I'll try to demo that. The Camel community is very important. You can find us on GitHub. We have a website, as I said. We're on IRC. And if you ever have any questions or ideas you want to throw, we have a mailing list, right? Okay, and last slide. If you're curious about Camel a little more, there's some additional resources. There's a lot of books about Apache Camel. The latest one is the Camel in Action book, 2nd edition, which I bought, which I highly recommend. All right, let's do a demo. So, all right. if you have any questions, so feel free to ask them, and I'll try to multitask. Right. All right. Hello? Yeah, it's on.
Have you been looking at the synthesis component?
Oh, the Synesys project?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, so there's a open source project called Synesys, and there's a FHIR connector as well. So I helped develop that, but it's still in beta, the FHIR connector, but you can definitely check out your Synesys project. So it's basically Camel with a UI, right? So there's a lot of demand for sort of citizens, developers. They don't want to code too much. So that's how that project got created, right? So. Move. Okay. Oh, okay. God damn it. Let me just close this. No. All right. Let me check this. All right. That was useful. All right. All right. Sorry for that. All right. So here I have a simple route here. What's this? What does this do? All right. Whatever that was. I have a simple route. And we're basically reading some V2 messages. All right, 5 more minutes. We're reading some V2 messages, and we're sending it to a FHIR server. So here I use the Camel plugin. And it's going to read some files. So here's some files here. I'm just going to copy those and pray that it works. All right, so work, input. Right, so it's going to log a bunch of things. And here, let's see our little management console, right? So here's a sort of graphical display of a route in your route diagram. You can check out the source here. You can even edit it, and then you can update it if you want. So here are a bunch of metrics, like we processed 5 messages. All right. And you have some metrics. So we spent the most time sending the messages to our FHIR server. You can start a debug session here, for example. Here, there we go. Up. Let's start debugging. All right. So, yeah. That's basically it. How are we doing on time? 4 minutes? Oh, of course. All right.
Yeah, in one of the routes you had a convert body to a bundle class.
Right.
So is there some magic going on there that it contacts the FHIR server for the capability statement or something? And will that automatically handle profiling and whatnot?
Right, right. So that's a good question. So converting, so was that example in the V2 message? Right? So Camel doesn't do that. It doesn't implement so EDI. What I did in the example was a basic mapping, simple use case. So I extracted the patient ID or name and last name, things like that. So if you want to do real mapping, so you have to either really implement your own, so have a lot of developers, or you partner up with a consultancy firm that has a product, and then you can integrate that with Camel. So at that level, that mapping is just too complex to bring into Camel. So that's why we're not bringing into Camel, and it's in separate projects. So that's basically the logic. But if anybody wants to open source their solution, you're welcome to. Yeah. Oh. Where's the? Oh, there it is.
Any thoughts on transactions?
The transaction API or transactions in general?
Yes, so making sure that it goes into the FHIR server and goes into it somewhere else, and if one of them falls over, it rolls back both.
So more like backups, you mean, or?
No, just your basic two-phase commit sort of stuff.
Oh, two-phase commit. So two-phase commit, like transactions, right? So I don't think the FHIR server supports that. But in Camel, we do have a construct. It's called a unit of work, and it's to work with components that aren't transactional. So, for example, the file component, right? Your file system doesn't support that, right? So in Camel, we do sort of hack around that, so it emulates a two-phase commit, right? And it's an extension point, so if you do have a component where you want to add transactions, you can implement those interfaces, and it'll emulate that. But in the end, it won't be as reliable as a database with a two-phase commit, right? 1 minute? Okay. Yeah, I mean, any questions? No? Yeah. All right.